On February 24th, 2019, a woman arrived at a ceramics factory in Hubei province in China. She walked through the front door into the main office where she saw a desk attendant. She informed them she was a quality control inspector and she was there that day to inspect their vehicles. The attendant was accustomed to their company being periodically inspected, and so she asked the woman if she needed any help, and the woman said, "Nope, I'm just going to roam around your building, check what I need to check, and then I'll be out of here." And so the attendant told her that was totally fine, and if she needed anything, just come back and she would help her. And so the inspector thanked her and then turned around and went out the front door and checked the vehicles in the front lot of the ceramics factory. And then after she was done, she went back into the main office. She walked past the attendant and out the back door into the very active yard where all day long these huge bulldozers would move around thousands of pounds of sand. And so the inspector walked out that back door and she scanned the yard and she saw there were two bulldozers doing just that, moving all around. And then off to the left side, there was a dump truck that seemed to be stationary. And so very confidently, she just walked right into the yard and made her way over to that dump truck. And then when she got there, she flagged the driver down and said she was an inspector and that she was going to check the vehicle out. And so the driver helped her by turning on and off signals and moving back and forth. And then at some point, the inspector needed the dump truck driver to back up a significant distance. She needed to watch him do that. And so she, the inspector, backed away from the dump truck until she was in the middle of the yard, standing right in front of this parked bulldozer. What happens next is all caught on video. And so as she's standing there and she's watching the dump truck back up right in front of her, the bulldozer driver right behind her turns on the machine and immediately lurches forward. Now, the driver of this bulldozer did not see the woman, and she was in his blind spot right in front of the bucket of his bulldozer. And he was not aware there was somebody on foot walking around the yard. It's an extremely dangerous place to be on foot. And so he goes right into her and he knocks her backwards. She falls into the bucket. She starts screaming, but no one can hear her. It's so loud. And the driver drives the bucket directly into a pile of sand and scoops up thousands of pounds of sand that come down directly on this woman. So now she's completely buried alive and being crushed by all this sand. And then the driver, completely oblivious, lifts the bucket up, turns around and drives across the yard and dumps the sand and the woman into a vibrating sand crusher. The vibrating sand crusher is exactly what it sounds like. It pulverizes bits of rock and stone and grinds them down into a very fine powder. The machines come in various shapes and sizes, but this one inside of this ceramics factory was a top-loaded version, and it basically looked like a big dumpster with this big opening at the top. And so these bulldozer drivers would take these clumps of sand and they would dump it in this opening at the top of this bin. And then once they dumped their sand into the opening, the machine would vibrate, causing the sand to filter its way down towards the bottom of the machine, where there were these big, vicious metal claws that constantly smashed together and would just completely obliterate anything that passed through them. In the video, when the driver dumps his bucket load into the sand crusher, you can actually see the woman falling in, but then she immediately jumps into action and begins trying to pull herself up and out of this pile. And at some point, she gets most of her upper body out and she waves and she gets the attention of the driver who's just dumped her into the sand crusher. And the driver, he stops right away. You can see the vehicle lurch to a stop. He leaps out and he starts running over to the sand crusher. But as he's running over, this woman who's waving and waving, at some point her leg or some other part of her gets grabbed by those jaws at the bottom of the machine, and she's pulled slowly down into the sand crusher and disappears under the sand. When this happens, the driver is frantic and he's screaming for other people in the factory to come over and help. And at some point, the others inside, they realize there's an emergency and they all run over. But when they realize what's happened, that someone has fallen into the sand crusher, they all just stop and stand there because they know there's nothing they can do. The woman was gone. In June of 2015, 45-year-old James Young landed his dream job. For the last several years, James had been a 5th grade teacher in East Canton, Ohio, teaching special education. And while he loved his job and he loved the kids he worked with, he had always had his eye on becoming a guidance counselor for high school students. In 1988, James had actually graduated from East Canton, Ohio High School. And ever since his graduation, he had wanted to come back to the school and help the next generation of East Canton students prepare for their lives as adults. And a guidance counselor was designed to do just that. James had applied for the job job before, but every time he applied, they would tell him that while he was qualified, there just wasn't a spot open for him. However, at the end of that school year, he was told a guidance counselor spot had opened up at the high school and the job was his if he wanted it. And so, of course, James said, yes, I'll take the job. And immediately he told his mother about this amazing news. And his mother, who lived only a block away from him in East Canton, Ohio, would say that her son was so ecstatic about the job that normally when summer break was coming up, he would really look forward to that time off from school. But now that he had this new job to look forward to, he was already anxious for the summer to be over. James was a single man, but he was not lonely. He had a number of very close, lifelong friends that he would spend virtually all of his off time with. And that summer, he did just that. He went out with his friends, they explored all of Ohio and outside surrounding areas. They spent a lot of time outside and they enjoyed each other's company. Towards the end of the summer, James and his friends knew it was time to schedule their annual trip to Cedar Point. Cedar Point is an amusement park about 2 hours northwest of East Canton, Ohio. It's situated right on the shores of Lake Erie, and it's known for its incredible roller coasters, of which they had 17, making them the park with the second most roller coasters in the world. Every summer, since James could remember, he and his very close friends would make a trip out to Cedar Point, usually at the end of the summer, to kind of cap off their vacation. After looking at their calendar, they decided that the best day to go would be Thursday, August 13th. This would give the group of friends one more fun thing to do before the following week James started his new job. So on the morning of that Thursday, the friends piled into a car and they made the 2-hour commute up to Cedar Point. And as soon as they got there, they went inside, they grabbed a map, and they began systematically hitting as many rides as they possibly could. And so by 4:30 p.m., they were totally exhausted. They'd been on virtually every ride. And so they were about to call it a day when James and his friends decide, hey, let's go on one more ride before we pack it in. And so they pull out their map and they're looking and they realize they haven't gone on one of their favorite rides. It was called the Raptor. The Raptor was not Cedar Point's biggest roller coaster, but it was their fastest. It would reach a top speed of 57 miles per hour. Passengers are seated 4 across with their feet dangling below them in these suspended chairs with the big harness that comes down. And then once the ride starts, they're brought slowly up this 137-foot hill. And then at the top, they pause before being dropped down into this nearly 4,000-foot long track that spins them upside down 6 different times. So James and his friends, they closed up their map and they ran their way over to the Raptor. They got in line, and by 4:50 p.m., they had made it to the front of the line. They got into their seats, their harness came down, and then the ride started. And they were pulled up to the top of the hill, they paused, and then they were launched down the track. And for 2 minutes, they zipped and zagged and loop-de-looped all through this track. And then it was just suddenly over. And the friends had a great time on the ride. Except James realized about halfway through the ride, when they were upside down, his phone and wallet had come out of his pockets, and he actually saw them fall down towards the ground. And although he didn't see exactly where they landed, he had a pretty good idea of where they were. And so after they got off the ride, the friends were kind of talking about how much fun it was. And James said to them, hey, I lost my cell phone and wallet. Will you guys come with me while I go look for them? And so the friends agreed. They left the Raptor station and they walked down the paved path until they were in front of this fence that said no trespassing. And so James gets up to the fence and he's looking inside of this fenced-in area, and he sees right in the middle of this restricted area is his phone and his wallet. And before James's friends could tell him not to do this, he had climbed over the fence and entered into this restricted area. He ran over to his phone and his wallet, he picked it up, and then when he stood back up again, the next wave of Raptor riders came blazing through the area, and the underside, the steel underside of the ride, hit James right in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. It threw him forward, he landed on his face, and immediately the park officials saw this happen. They stopped the ride, but the riders on board the Raptor, they didn't know what was going on. And so they're stopped on the ride, they're looking down and they hear people screaming, and they look down and they see there's this man, James, lying face down on the ground with blood pooling around his head. The fence James had climbed over was there specifically to keep visitors from getting too close to this one low point in the Raptor ride where the ride can come through and it can hit you. And so medical workers, they rush over, they hop over the fence, they get to James, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. That day, Cedar Park was put under investigation for James's death, but after reviewing the footage and talking to witnesses, the investigation was closed and they determined that the park was not at fault. James, despite being a very intelligent and sensible man, had a brief lapse in judgment, and it unfortunately cost him his life. Today, Cedar Park is still open for business and the Raptor ride is still operational. On August 14th, 2012, Celestino Cervantes picked up 28-year-old Victor Diaz for work. Celestino was an expert roofer, and he had just hired Victor to come on his crew and help him with a particular job. This was going to be Victor's first day as a roofer, but for the past 10 years he had worked in construction, so he was familiar with the operation. The two men arrived at their job site in San Antonio, Texas around 8 a.m. that morning. They were in charge of putting a new roof on a 115-year-old building that was being redeveloped into a fancy steakhouse. Until 2001, this building had been used by a brewing company to house their enormous boilers. As such, this building was referred to as the boiler house. Protruding from the boiler house roof was this large metal duct that was 15 feet long and almost looked like a covered walkway, and it connected to the side of this huge smokestack. This duct and smokestack used to be how the built-up condensation inside the boiler house was able to travel up and out of the building. When the two roofers got out of their truck, Celestino told Victor to take his tools and make his way up to the roof of the boiler house and get to work, and that he had a few things he had to do down on the ground floor, but he would be up to check on him in a little bit. Celestino turned around and was fiddling with his equipment inside of the truck while Victor made his way into the building and out of sight. An hour and a half later, Celestino went up to the roof to check on Victor, but he couldn't find Victor anywhere and he couldn't find his tools anywhere. So Celestino went back down into the main section of this building where other contractors that were working on this renovation were, and he began asking them, hey, have you seen this guy, Victor? He works with me, I can't find him, and no one had seen him. And so Celestino's thinking to himself, well, I guess Victor must have left. But that didn't really make any sense because Victor didn't have a vehicle and he didn't live nearby. But Celestino's thinking, you know what, maybe somebody came and picked him up. Now, unfortunately, Victor did not carry a cell phone, so nobody had any way of getting directly in contact with him. So Celestino leaves the building and he calls Victor's brother and he asks him, have you seen Victor? Do you know where he might have gone? And Victor's brother says, no, I haven't seen him since this morning when he left with you. So Victor's brother began calling around to friends and family and asked them if they had seen Victor, but nobody knew where he was. So for the rest of the day, Celestino and the rest of Victor's friends and family, they went out looking for Victor at the job site and around the surrounding areas, but there was just no sign of him. And so that night, Victor's brother went to the police to file a missing person report. But the police told him that it was really too early to file a report because Victor was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, and that he should just come back in a day or two if Victor still has not shown up. 2 days go by and Victor had still not shown up, so Victor's sister-in-law went back to the police and says, okay, now I want to file a missing person report. We don't know where he is, no one can get in touch with him, we need your help. But the officer she spoke to told her that she still needed to wait another 5 days to process this request. It would turn out this was just not true. It was a mistake. There was no arbitrary waiting period to file a missing person report. So without any help from the police, Victor's friends and family and co-workers spent the next several days scouring San Antonio, scouring the job site, looking everywhere for him and handing out flyers and asking people if they'd seen him, but no one had. He had just disappeared. By Monday the following week, so 6 days after Victor has gone missing, his family had printed out dozens of these huge posters with his face on them and a number to call if you had any information about him, and their plan was to distribute them the following morning all over San Antonio. But the following morning, before they headed out, they got a call. Victor had been found. 7 days earlier, when Celestino told Victor to head inside and make his way to the roof and begin the project, Victor had gotten his tools, gone inside, he made his way up the stairwell to the second floor, and then he made a series of odd decisions. Instead of making his way to the access door and climbing his way up to the roof, he went to the far side of the second floor where there were all these wooden barriers preventing people from going any farther. He climbed over all these barriers and he reached the entrance to that huge duct where the condensation used to go. And so from his perspective, he would have been looking into this duct and it would have been completely pitch black because it connected to that smokestack and the smokestack was totally sealed off. But despite not having any idea where this tunnel goes and it clearly not being the place Celestino told him to go, Victor decides to just get into this tunnel, which required bending over because it was only 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide. So he gets inside of this tunnel and he begins shuffling his way deeper and deeper into this tunnel until he reaches the end of the tunnel where it actually connects into the smokestack. Now at the top of this duct where it connects to the smokestack, there wasn't a grate or bars or any sort of barrier that would stop you from spilling into the smokestack. And because it was totally pitch black, Victor, when he made it to the edge of that duct, he just kept on walking and fell 20 feet down to the bottom of the smokestack. And so in total darkness, Victor, who was probably badly hurt from the fall, began feeling around the inside of the chimney, looking for a way out, and he eventually found a hatch that was big enough for him to fit through, but when he felt up against it, he realized it was locked from the outside and it wouldn't even budge. He couldn't even get light to come in through a crack. It was totally sealed off. And that was the only way out of the smokestack unless he could get back up to the duct, but there was no way to do that. He most likely began screaming for help, but he was encased in thick brick, and so his sound wouldn't have traveled. It would have been completely muffled. Plus, the smokestack was fairly far away from the job site, which was very noisy as it is, and so there was just no way they could have heard him. And the smokestack and the duct were not part of the renovation, and so there was absolutely no foot traffic over around the smokestack. He was completely alone, no one knew he was there, and there was no way out. 7 days after Victor fell into the smokestack, workers over at the job site, they noticed this huge swarm of flies over around the base of the smokestack. There were so many flies over there, they decided they had to go investigate. And so as they walked closer and closer to the smokestack, they were hit with this overwhelming stench of death and decay. And then when they got to the smokestack, they could see the flies were centralized on that hatch at the bottom. And so they cut the lock, they opened it up, and inside they found Victor's body. And they saw his hands were badly bloodied and bruised, and they were pressed up against the inside of the hatch, indicating in his final moments he was desperately trying to open that hatch and save himself, but there was just no way to do that. Although no one knows this for sure, it's believed Victor confused the condensation duct with the access point.
Nikki Halpin couldn't believe how well things were going. On January 8th, 2004, the 32-year-old single mother was at a pizzeria in Safety Harbor, Florida, enjoying a night out with her boyfriend Chris and her sons, 7-year-old Drew and 9-year-old Max. Nikki had only been seeing Chris for a few months, and he hadn't had much interaction with her boys yet. But so far, tonight, he was nailing it. Chatting easily with Drew about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and also making sure to include Max too. When Nikki heard Max start to giggle over something Chris had said, Nikki suddenly felt this spark of happiness. She liked Chris, but until tonight, she really hadn't been convinced that their relationship had long-term potential. They'd met online, gone on a few dates, and it had been fine. Not exciting, but fine. But maybe that was okay. Chris was about her age, and he was an engineer with his life together. He checked the boxes, and maybe that was all she needed. Somebody who was solid, simple, and stable, who could make her boys laugh. I mean, that kind of relationship would certainly be a big change for Nikki. Her ex-husband, Donald, had been the opposite of Chris. He was an imposing prison guard and former boxer, built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and was almost twice her age. They met when Nikki was just 22, and Donald was 41. Her family had thought he was too old for her, but she had fallen in love with his rugged good looks and charm. But then life got complicated. Their eldest child, Max, was born with health issues, and the endless hospital bills and stress really strained their marriage. Donald started drinking more, their fights got worse and worse, and after nearly a decade together, it was just over. They separated in 2001 and finalized the divorce 2 years later. But for Nikki, she had actually been relieved. She had her freedom back. And so pretty quickly, she had struck up another relationship with a young, fit HVAC repairman named Dan Welch. Dan had seemed really exciting and charming, and for a while, Nikki had been convinced he was the one. But Dan didn't work out. He really just wanted to have fun, not get married. And so Nikki had ultimately dumped him. After Dan, Nikki had gone on plenty more dates, but Chris was really the first guy in a long time who felt like he could actually be something real. After dinner, Nikki and her sons drove Chris back home and dropped him off around 9:30 p.m. Less than 15 minutes later, they pulled into their own driveway, where the sight of the new house they'd just recently moved into made Nikki smile. It was much bigger and nicer than anywhere she'd lived with Donald, and the city of Safety Harbor felt exactly how she'd hoped. Quiet, warm, and safe. The perfect place to raise her kids. They went inside, and immediately the boys kicked off their shoes and headed in opposite directions. Drew went to the living room to finish his homework, while Max ran straight to his bedroom and powered on his video game console. As for Nikki, she walked down the hall to her office, and she turned on the family computer. The Instant Messenger app was still open from earlier, and she glanced at the text window, and she saw there was a new message from Chris. It said, "How'd you get home so fast?" Nikki frowned, not sure why he would ask that, but when her eyes moved up the chat window, she saw that a message had been sent from her account at 9:33 p.m., while she was still out driving. The message contained only 2 letters, HB. Now, keep in mind, this was 2004, so the instant messenger app could not have been on Nikki's phone. It could only be accessed from her computer, which meant that that message could have only been sent from right here, this physical location, by somebody other than her. Nikki, who now had goosebumps all over her body, just stared at the screen and then typed back to Chris, "I didn't write that." Nikki grabbed her home phone and called Chris, and when he answered and she explained what was going on, he sounded confused and worried about her. Nikki asked him to please stay on the line while she looked around her house. There could be an intruder. And so while clutching the phone and doing her best to stay calm, Nikki began going from room to room, checking to make sure they were empty. All the while, the only sound that filled the house were the beeps and chimes of Max's video game. At some point, after checking one of these rooms, Nikki went back into the hallway and was going towards the next room to check. However, before she got there, she heard something and turned around. And when she did, she froze. "15 minutes later, at approximately 9:50 p.m., Deputy Brad Ferguson of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office was out on patrol when a dispatcher's voice came over the radio. A man had just called 911 in a panic. He said that he'd been on the phone with his girlfriend when she suddenly started screaming. The girlfriend's name was Nikki, and she was home with her 2 sons at 12 Clearview Drive in Safety Harbor. Deputy Ferguson switched on a siren and floored it towards the address. When he arrived, he knocked hard on the door. And to his surprise, a middle-aged man answered, looking very confused. Deputy Ferguson asked if someone named Nikki lived there, and the man said yes. The man called out Nikki's name, and a minute later, a teenage girl appeared. But to Ferguson, something just didn't feel right. Nothing about this scene matched the urgency or the information in that 911 call. Deputy Ferguson radioed dispatch and quickly realized there'd been a mistake. He was at the wrong house. The caller had given the wrong address, and it was just pure coincidence that there happened to be a Nikki there, too. The real location was 15 Clearview Drive, literally next door. This mistake meant Deputy Ferguson had lost precious minutes. He raced 30 feet over to the correct house, and the man from the wrong house followed right behind because he knew Nikki Halpin's family. They were neighbors. The lights were on inside of Nikki's home, but when they knocked, no one answered. The neighbors started shouting for Nikki and Drew and Max, and eventually 2 faces appeared in the window next to the front door. It was the boys, but there was no sign of Nikki. The boys recognized their neighbor and opened the door. Deputy Ferguson immediately noticed blood spatter on Max's t-shirt. When he asked where their mother was, Drew pointed down the hall. Ferguson walked into the house and headed in the direction the boy had pointed. And moments later, he stepped into the bedroom. And there was Nikki. She lay motionless on the bed. The blankets around her were soaked with blood, and there were deep wounds on the left side of her head. It was instantly clear this was a crime scene. Ferguson realized the attacker could still be inside, so he shouted for Nikki's neighbor to take the boys back to his home and lock the doors. After that, he radioed for backup and began clearing the house on his own. Gun drawn, he went room by room, closet by closet, until he was sure that whoever had done this was already gone. It frustrated Deputy Ferguson to think that the time he'd wasted going to the wrong house might have made all the difference. It might have given Nikki's attacker the chance to slip away. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived, followed by a fleet of police cars. Nikki was actually still breathing, but barely. So paramedics airlifted her to a trauma center, fighting to keep her alive the whole way. Meanwhile, the evidence retrieval crew got to work processing the crime scene. The house was littered with toys and sports equipment, which made searching for fingerprints or DNA even more time-consuming than usual, so the team knew they were in for a long night. Shortly after midnight, 2 detectives arrived to take over the investigation for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Their names were Ed Judy and Robert Snipes, and they were both seasoned investigators with over a decade of experience under their belts. Judy and Snipes spoke to the officers processing the scene, who told them that, as of right now, Nikki was still clinging to life at the hospital. But based on what they'd seen, the chances she'd survive were slim. Whoever had attacked her appeared to have hit her in the head and upper body over and over again with something very heavy and blunt. But so far, the evidence retrieval crew had not found whatever that weapon was. In fact, they hadn't found much of anything. There was no evidence of a break-in or signs that anything had been stolen. But Detective Judy was not surprised. The viciousness of the attack did not feel like a robbery, and he was already beginning to suspect that the motive might be personal. After checking out the crime scene, Judy and Snipes left the house and headed next door to speak with Drew and Max, who were still with the neighbor. They tried to talk to the 9-year-old, Max, but he was completely unresponsive. Nikki's neighbor explained that Max had medical issues and rarely spoke, and now he may be traumatized too, and so that left 7-year-old Drew. The detectives sat Drew down in the kitchen, and as gently as they could, they asked him to tell them what he saw. There was a long silence, and at first, the detectives weren't sure the boy would even answer them. But then, he started talking. Drew told the detectives that he had been in the living room doing math problems when he heard his mother scream. He looked up and he saw her running down the hall, and there was this large man in dark clothes with a black mask on, carrying something long and shiny, maybe a metal baseball bat. He said his mother screamed for him to go hide, and then she disappeared into the bedroom, and the masked man followed her inside. Drew was so scared he couldn't move, but he followed his mother's instructions and he hid until he heard the attacker leave. At that point, he snuck out of his hiding place and ran into the bedroom, where he found his mother, unconscious, and his brother Max, cowering behind the bed. Drew took Max's hand and led him to the bathroom, where the brothers hid until they heard their neighbor's voice calling them from outside. When Drew finished telling the story, the detectives realized that the boy's ordeal was far worse than anyone realized. Max, the 9-year-old, had actually been in the bedroom with his mother while she was being attacked. By this point, it was nearing 2 a.m., and the boys were obviously exhausted. But Detective Judy had one more question. He asked Drew if he recognized the attacker. Now, Judy didn't expect much of an answer out of Drew, since the man had worn a mask, but to his surprise, Drew nodded and said yes. The boy looked right at Judy and said, "It was the man who knocks on the windows." On the drive back to the station, Detective Judy and Snipes talked over everything they'd learned, starting with Drew's final comment about the man who knocks on the windows. They had asked Drew what he meant, but the boy had not been able to explain beyond that. The detectives weren't sure if the man who knocks on the windows was a real clue or a garbled story from a deeply traumatized child, but whichever it was, they couldn't make sense of it right now. So they agreed to log the statement and come back to it later. For now, they decided to focus on the information from Drew that did sound reliable, and that was that the intruder was a man. This fact lined up both with their suspicions and with their training, which told them that whenever a woman is attacked, the culprit is usually an intimate partner. And so, in the detective's eyes, all the men in Nikki's life were now potential suspects. When the detectives got back to the station, Nikki's boyfriend, Chris, was waiting in an interview room to give his statement. Chris had been at his house talking to Nikki over the phone when he actually heard the attack. He was the one who actually made the 911 call. Logistically, it seemed hard to imagine how he could have done those two things if he had committed the attack himself. But at this point, Judy and Snipes weren't actually ruling anyone out. They knew Chris could have hired a hitman, for example, and there were a couple elements of Chris's story that raised questions. For example, they wanted to know why Chris gave dispatch the wrong address. The mix-up cost valuable time that possibly allowed Nikki's attacker to escape. And they also wanted to know, when Chris heard his girlfriend being attacked, why didn't he try to go to her house to check on her himself? He could have called 911 on the way from his cell phone. So the detectives sat down across from Chris and got right into it. Their first question, about the wrong address, Chris answered easily. He said he had been in a panic and simply mixed up the numbers. But the second question, about why he didn't do more to help Nikki, or at least go check on her, seemed to trip Chris up, and he kind of stumbled through a pretty confusing explanation. He said he had considered going to her house when he heard her scream on the phone, but he didn't because he was afraid that someone was waiting outside his own door and would attack him too if he tried to leave. To Judy and Snipes, this answer just seemed weird. There was no reason for Chris to think he would be targeted in some kind of coordinated two-pronged attack, and he hadn't mentioned it to the 911 dispatcher at all. It sounded like a pretty outlandish excuse. And so by the end of the interview, both Judy and Snipes were more skeptical of Chris than they had been when they walked in. But they still couldn't figure out a way for him to have been present for the attack while he was also home talking to Nikki on his landline phone. So despite having a few misgivings, they thanked Chris for his time and let him go. As soon as Chris was gone, Snipes called the hospital for an update on Nikki's status. It was now 3 a.m., 6 hours after the attack. Snipes was not expecting good news, so it came as a relief when the doctors told him that no, Nikki is actually still alive. Her vitals were stable, and it was looking more likely that she'd survive the night. Still, her doctors stressed that her condition was dire. After getting off the phone, Snipes shared the news with his partner, and then they got to work on their next task, contacting Nikki's family to fill them in and see if they knew anything useful. Unfortunately, a quick search told them that Nikki's parents and siblings were 1,300 miles away in Massachusetts, and this kind of news was just too serious to deliver over the phone. So they called up the nearest precinct and arranged for a local officer to drive out to her parents' place and talk to them in person. That local officer knocked on Nikki's parents' home right as the sun was coming up. Nikki's mother answered, looking confused and tired. When the officer told her about the attack on her daughter, she gasped and began crying. The officer reached out a hand, offering her support, but the mother gathered herself quickly and then looked up through her tears and told the officer she could guess who had done this: Nikki's ex-husband, Donald. To explain this, Nikki's mother told a story that stretched back a decade to 1994, in the early days of Nikki and Donald's marriage. That November, their oldest son Max was born with life-threatening complications. A buildup of fluid in his skull put too much pressure on his brain, and he only narrowly survived. Over the next few years, Max endured dozens of brain surgeries, and during one of those surgeries, a nurse accidentally gave him the wrong medication, and it nearly killed him. Nikki and Donald sued the hospital over the incident, kicking off a drawn-out and very expensive legal battle that created a lot of financial pressure on the family. These new money problems, along with Max's ongoing health issues, led to constant stress in their household, which eventually contributed to the collapse of Nikki and Donald's marriage. And then soon after their divorce was finalized, the hospital finally settled in the case, granting Max a trust fund of $1.5 million. And in the legal wrangling that followed, Nikki had become sole custodian of that fund, and Donald was shut out completely. He would never see a dime. This is why Nikki's mom thought Donald might have attacked her daughter. She believed that he simply harbored a grudge over the money. Detectives Judy and Snipes were already on their way to Donald's place when the Massachusetts officer who visited Nikki's mom called them to tell them about Donald's potential million-dollar motive. Now, Judy and Snipes already considered Donald a suspect simply because he was Nikki's ex-husband, but this new information shot him right to the top of their suspect list. They found Donald at home in his bachelor pad apartment, sitting down to coffee and the morning newspaper. When they told him that Nikki had been attacked last night and was in critical condition at the hospital, Donald looked at them in shock and then demanded to know where his kids were. The detectives calmly explained that the boys were perfectly safe, but they currently were in the custody of social services. They couldn't be released to Donald until the detectives were confident that he wasn't involved in the attack. Now, Judy and Snipes watched as Donald processed the fact that they were treating him like a suspect. He seemed surprised, and in a tight voice, he told them to come in and ask whatever they wanted. Inside, as Judy and Snipes launched into their questions, it quickly became clear that the divorce was a very sensitive topic for Donald, but not just because of that trust. He did say he did not think Nikki was managing the fund properly, but beyond that, he told the detectives that actually, he was still in love with Nikki. But this admission really only made Donald even more attractive as a suspect. Maybe, the detectives thought, he was jealous that Nikki was dating other people. So they asked Donald if he would come back to the station for a polygraph test, and he said yes. Detectives Judy and Snipes were hoping to use this polygraph test to press Donald about whether he really still loved Nikki or if his love had turned to anger. They wanted to try to catch him in a lie. But as soon as they got the machine up and running, Donald started passing question after question without so much as a blip. The detectives started to wonder if maybe they and Nikki's family had misjudged Donald. But then it happened. Judy asked Donald if he knew who hurt Nikki. Donald said no, and the machine registered a sharp rise in his heartbeat. This signified a possible lie. Snipes felt a rush of exhilaration, but he didn't mention anything about it until the test was done. When it was done, he confronted Donald about the question he'd failed. Donald took a long time to respond, and when he finally did, he said that he hadn't lied. He really didn't know who hurt Nikki. But if he was being totally transparent, he did suspect someone. He hadn't said anything until now because he didn't want to point fingers without any evidence. But if the detectives really wanted to know his opinion, Donald thought they should look into Dan Welch, the young, fit HVAC repairman Nikki dated after their separation. To both Judy and Snipes, Donald's accusation against Dan Welch just seemed like a desperate attempt to divert attention away from him. But then Donald explained why he suspected Dan, and it was surprisingly convincing. Donald said that Nikki actually used to vent to him all the time about Dan. At first, she'd been really into their relationship, but when she began talking about marriage, Dan apparently wasn't interested, so Nikki had dumped him. But after she dumped him, Donald said that Nikki had told him it was like a switch had flipped. Dan was devastated. He refused to accept that it was over and kept calling Nikki and begging her to take him back for months afterward. Eventually, Nikki turned to Donald for advice, and he told her to take out a restraining order. When Judy and Snipes finished their interview with Donald, they still weren't convinced he was innocent. However, they now had a second suspect, Dan Welch. The first thing Judy and Snipes did as they began digging into Dan was to search for that restraining order that Donald apparently had told Nikki to file. But there wasn't one. Not only had Nikki not taken out a restraining order against Dan, but nobody had. In fact, Dan had no criminal record of any kind. And the more Judy and Snipes thought about it, the more they realized that what Donald told them about Dan just didn't add up. Dan Welch had gotten himself dumped for not wanting to marry Nikki, while Donald fully admitted that he himself was still in love with her. And that was quite a motive. But before they could make any final judgments, they needed to talk to Dan. But that interview would have to wait. It was now late in the afternoon on the day after Nikki's attack. Detectives Judy and Snipes had been up for more than 24 hours working this case, and they were fading fast. Before they spoke to any more suspects, they needed to get some sleep. The pair reconvened the next morning at the station, and the first thing they did was call the hospital to check on Nikki. And unfortunately, the news was bad. She had spent 36 hours on life support, she was unconscious, and showing no signs of brain activity. It was unlikely she was ever going to recover. This put the detectives in a somber mood as they headed out to talk to Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan. Dan lived in Clearwater, just a few miles away from Nikki's home in Safety Harbor. Judy and Snipes wanted to catch him off guard, so they didn't call ahead before they knocked on his door. When Dan answered, the detectives studied his face as they told him they were here to speak about Nikki. They deliberately did not tell him why, because they wanted to see if the mention of Nikki made him nervous, or angry, or emotional in any way. But Dan just stared at them, like he couldn't understand what they were saying. In fact, he was acting like he didn't even know who Nikki was. So when Dan just continued to look confused, the detectives repeated themselves, this time using Nikki's full name. And that's when a look of recognition passed over Dan's face. He quickly waved them inside and said he'd been confused because he always called Nikki Nicole. Dan said he had heard about the attack on the radio and had been expecting a visit. As they walked to his living room, Dan kept saying how he was happy to help the investigation. But to the detectives, he seemed almost too eager. Dan's upbeat demeanor felt forced, and Judy and Snipes could sense anxiety just beneath the surface. They had barely sat down when Dan had already offered to provide DNA samples and invited the detectives to search his apartment for evidence. The detectives told Dan that yes, they would love to do both of those things, but first, they just wanted to talk. They told him that they had heard his breakup with Nikki might have gotten a bit ugly, and so they wanted to hear his side of the story. If there was any truth to Donald's accusations about Dan harassing Nikki following the breakup, the detectives thought this question might trigger some sort of reaction. But Dan just sort of shrugged it off. He said he had gotten over Nicole a long time ago, and he was now seeing somebody else. Dan also had an alibi for the night of the attack. He said he had spent the evening working out with a buddy and then went home around 10 p.m., and then he called his girlfriend. Dan pulled up contact information for both of those people and gave it to Judy and Snipes. At this point, the detectives weren't sure what to think of Dan. They figured his alibi would check out. Otherwise, Dan would not have volunteered it. So maybe Dan's anxiety they were sensing was just regular anxiety. I mean, plenty of totally innocent people get nervous around cops and often kind of over-explain themselves like Dan was doing. It didn't necessarily mean he was hiding something. But just to be safe, Judy asked Dan if he'd be willing to come to the station to take a polygraph. And like Judy expected, Dan said yes. When they got back to the station, they set Dan up in a private room and hooked him up to the polygraph machine. Dan said he was ready, so Judy began asking questions, with Snipes watching the monitor for signs of emotional distress. And pretty much right away, Snipes saw the needle spike. That meant Dan was hiding something. According to the machine, he was lying. But as Judy asked another question and another, something weird began to happen. Every question, even baseline questions about what day of the week it was, the machine would mark Dan's response as a possible lie. And with these kinds of results, it was hard to know if Dan was actually lying or if he was just so anxious that basically anything he said was setting off the machine. The detectives both knew that even in the best cases, polygraph tests are not perfect. The fact that Dan was failing so badly definitely raised their suspicions of him, but it wasn't a reason to hold or charge him. So after asking him the remainder of the questions, which Dan basically failed entirely, they had no choice but to let him go. That evening, Judy and Snipes talked through the case, weighing their potential suspects. They had now spoken to the last 3 men in Nikki's life. First, there was Chris, Nikki's current boyfriend. His explanation about not rushing to help Nikki because he thought he might be in danger, because there was somebody outside his door, still struck them as extremely weird. But the fact that he had called 911 as the attack was ongoing made it hard to see him as the culprit. They still hadn't ruled him out completely, but he was admittedly less suspicious than their other 2 suspects. Next, there was Donald, Nikki's ex-husband. And of all 3 suspects, he had the strongest motive, since with Nikki out of the way, he would not only get custody of their kids, but also control of a $1 million trust. And the fact that he had pointed the finger at Dan, Nikki's ex-boyfriend, was also suspicious, especially since there was no criminal record of the problems Donald had told them about. That on its own was almost enough to convince them that Donald was their guy, he was guilty. Except that their third suspect, Dan, the ex-boyfriend, had failed every question on his polygraph test. All in all, the detectives agreed that it was still too early to draw any firm conclusions. Just 2 days had passed since the attack, and so far, the investigation had been moving at a breakneck pace. Judy and Snipes felt good about how much they'd learned already, but didn't want to miss an important clue by rushing things. They would continue interviewing Nikki's family and friends, while keeping a particularly close eye on Dan and Donald. Those 2 they were the most suspicious of, and they figured if one of them was guilty, hopefully they would slip up and do something to give themselves away. The next day was January 11th. 3 days had passed since the attack, and incredibly, Nikki was still clinging to life. However, that morning, her doctors told her family that she would never wake up. So, Nikki's family said their final goodbyes at the hospital, then doctors turned off the machines that were keeping her alive. Nikki died shortly afterwards. And so that meant that Judy and Snipes were now officially dealing with a homicide case. Also, Nikki's death started a ticking clock on the custody of her sons. Drew and Max were still in social services because Judy and Snipes considered their father, Donald, a suspect. But that couldn't continue indefinitely. If the detectives didn't charge Donald soon, the boys would be released into his care, and Donald would take control of Max's $1 million trust. Over the next few days, Judy and Snipes continued interviewing Nikki's friends and colleagues, but they didn't come up with much new information. The only interesting tidbit came from a friend of Nikki, and it didn't help the detectives narrow things down at all. This friend said she thought the killer could be Chris, who was Nikki's most recent boyfriend and the one who had called 911 during the attack. This friend said that Chris was jealous and the couple argued all the time. And so all this left Judy and Snipes in a tough spot. They had lots of suspicions, but no hard evidence against anyone. A week passed, then another, with no significant new leads, and the detectives started to worry that their case was about to go cold. On February 16th, just over a month after Nikki's death, an office assistant at the sheriff's department was transcribing audio files from the case as part of the standard bookkeeping process. The case was approaching a dead end, and she was responsible for filing everything away properly. This assistant had already processed the dozens of hours of police interviews with Donald, Dan, and Chris, and she was nearly done. The last file on her list was the actual 911 call Chris had made on the night of the attack, January 8th. The assistant didn't expect it to take long, but when she put on her headphones and hit play, she heard something on this call that made her jump out of her chair. She had to stop and rewind the tape, going back to the start over and over again, just to make sure she wasn't hearing things. The audio was garbled, and it was hard to tell what was actually going on, but after a few listens, she was sure. It was not her imagination. The sound she had heard was definitely there, just buried under multiple layers of distortion. So the assistant dashed down the hall to Detective Judy's office and played the file for him and Snipes. At first, the detectives couldn't understand what she was so excited about, but then the assistant adjusted the levels a bit and played the call again. This time, through the crackly static, Judy and Snipes heard what she was talking about. Just like that, they knew exactly who killed Nikki Halpin. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and the recording of the 911 call, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Halpin on the night of January 8th, 2004. The house at 15 Clearview Drive, Safety Harbor, was silent and empty when, at approximately 9:30 p.m., the killer rode up on a bike. They stashed their bike out of view beside the garage and then looked around quickly to make sure nobody was walking past. Then, satisfied they were alone, the killer lifted the garage door up maybe a foot or so and rolled underneath. Once the killer was inside, they began to rifle through their backpack. They pulled out a mask and put it on. Then they took out a heavy silver flashlight, so large that at a glance, it almost looked like a metal baseball bat. Then, with the flashlight in hand, the killer walked from the garage into the house itself. Within moments, the killer was creeping through the quiet house down the hall. They headed to Nikki's office, where they switched on the computer. When the screen lit up, the instant messenger app was already open, and Nikki's conversation with Chris was visible on the screen. Just then, the icon beside Chris's handle changed colors, indicating that he was now online. The killer thought for a moment, and then hit a couple of keys at random and hit enter. A few seconds later, a response came through from Chris. "How'd you get home so fast? You must have run every red light." As the killer read that, they smiled. Now, they knew Nikki was on her way home. Killer switched off the computer screen and walked into a different room and hid. A few minutes later, the killer heard the front door open, followed by the sounds of Drew and Max running happily into the house. The killer stayed where they were, thinking Nikki would soon pass by. But the wait took longer than they expected. And so as the minutes ticked by, the killer grew impatient. And so eventually they poked their head out of the room where they were hiding, and right then they heard Nikki talking to someone in the hall. It sounded like she was on the phone, and she was saying something about an intruder in the house. With a sudden pang of horror, the killer realized their mistake. Nikki must have gone into her office. She had seen the message and realized someone had sent it from her computer when she was still gone. There was no more time to wait. The killer sprinted into the hall, where Nikki turned around, saw them, and screamed. The sound filled the killer with a blinding rage, and they shouted right back at her, "Nicole, calm down!" But Nikki didn't calm down. She turned and ran. And as she passed by the living room, she shouted for Drew to hide, and then continued into the bedroom to try to help Max hide. but the killer chased after her and grabbed her and threw her onto the bed. She screamed and tried to fight them off, but the killer swung that heavy flashlight as hard as they could into her head and her shoulders and her neck over and over until she stopped moving. The killer completely ignored Max, the 9-year-old who was right next to the bed cowering, who had just watched this happen to his mother. The killer simply turned, dashed out of the room, taking the bloody flashlight with them. However, what the killer failed to notice was the phone lying on the bed beside Nikki's limp body. The line was still open, and on the other end, Chris was listening over speakerphone while he spoke to the police on his cell phone. And so with Chris's phone so close together, the audio from Nikki's room was picked up and recorded along the 911 call. It was very faint and heavily degraded, but with a little effort, the phrase, "Nicole, calm down," could be heard in the background. And this was the phrase that blew the investigation wide open. When the sheriff's department assistant had heard those words, she instantly recognized the killer's voice, since she'd just transcribed hours of interrogation videos with them. But it wasn't just the voice that gave the killer away. One word caught on that tape sealed the killer's fate. Every single person in her life called her Nikki. Every person except for one. Only Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan Welch, the HVAC guy, called her Nicole. It was his voice on the recording. His voice saying, "Nicole, calm down," right before he struck her with the flashlight in front of her own kids. It would turn out that Nikki's ex-husband, Donald, had been telling the truth when he said Dan was harassing Nikki. Ever since their breakup, Dan had been stalking Nikki, showing up at her house without warning and pounding on the windows while shouting for her to come out and talk. And this fact likely explains the strange way Nikki's son Drew had described his mother's killer. To a child, Dan was the man who knocks on the windows. Dan was indicted in January of 2006 and eventually pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and will be eligible for parole in 2028. In early 2014, Sarah Weber walked through the front door of her home in Massachusetts after a long day at the sports supply company she started with her husband, Paul. They were both avid runners, and they had turned their passion into a business, selling water belts and other sports products online. But owning their company meant the workday was never really done, and so sometimes Sarah's life felt like a three-ring circus. As Sarah took off her jacket, her 3 kids, ages 3, 5, and 7, came running up to her to give her a hug. Sarah liked to get down on her knees and greet all 3 of them at their level, but tonight, the effort made her wince. She'd been feeling so tired lately that she hadn't run in a while, and now, just bending down, she could feel all this strain in her muscles. But she tried not to show her discomfort in front of the kids as she stood back up, and then she made her way into the living room where Paul was watching TV. Sarah gave Paul a kiss, then sank down on the couch next to him. She told him she'd spent the whole day in the warehouse, dealing mostly with administrative tasks. But now that she was sitting down, Sarah realized just how exhausted she actually was. But it made no sense to her. Taking care of orders and inventory could be tiring, but Sarah had never felt this weak after a day's work. She was only 39 years old, but her body felt like lead and her brain felt foggy. She also felt this sense of gloominess that she couldn't quite place. Sarah just felt off in a way that did not seem normal, and these feelings had been going on for a couple of weeks now. Sarah and Paul agreed that whatever was going on with her had to be more than just simple fatigue. So the next morning, Sarah scheduled a doctor's appointment just to be safe. A few days later, Sarah sat on an exam table in her doctor's office. Her muscles still ached and her head was throbbing. Sarah told the doctor that basically she had always been healthy, aside from some mild asthma, which didn't even require medication. She and her husband enjoyed being physically active. Sarah told the doctor that she had never smoked, didn't take drugs, or drink to excess. She admitted that her life was busy, but she loved her business and had fun keeping up with her kids. She couldn't understand why she suddenly felt so tired. Her doctor just smiled at her and said that running a business while raising 3 kids was enough to wear anybody out. Also, he told her that her blood test showed she was slightly anemic, which meant her red blood cells weren't getting enough oxygen to fuel her body's tissues. He said it was very common among young women and it could cause feelings of fatigue and weakness. And so he prescribed her some iron supplements and said that they should quickly help her with her energy levels and overall mood. And so Sarah left the office feeling relieved that she would start feeling better soon. But 2 months later, Sarah was back in her doctor's office. Although she had been taking the iron supplements, she still felt weak. On top of that, she had begun to feel this overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. She'd spent the night before lying in bed and staring at the right side of her abdomen, which felt very strange, almost as if it was too full. After listening to Sarah's symptoms, the doctor reviewed her blood work and said that the medication appeared to have taken care of her anemia. He'd also taken a look at her abdomen, and nothing seemed wrong. However, her mounting anxiety and fatigue were very concerning, and so he wanted to screen her for depression. Sarah felt confused. She was tired and feeling down, but she didn't think she was depressed. However, she still agreed to take the screening. If anything, the screening would give her some peace of mind that she was not depressed. However, to her surprise, the screening did the opposite. It showed that she might actually be experiencing depression. Sarah knew the diagnosis wasn't meant to be a judgment on her as a person, but she still sort of felt like she'd flunked a test. And so she wondered if this meant her physical symptoms were actually just in her head. A month later, in May of 2014, Sarah's husband Paul watched Sarah drag herself into the house after another day's work. She looked weak and thin. It scared Paul to see her this way. Paul knew she had been carefully taking the antidepressant medication for weeks now, but it didn't seem to be helping at all. She'd also begun walking for exercise and doing yoga, but her energy was still very low. Sarah was doing everything the doctor recommended, but her health just wasn't improving. In fact, she had lost an alarming amount of weight. And most days, Paul would wake up in the morning to find Sarah lying beside him, completely exhausted. She told him she basically wasn't sleeping, and when she was sleeping, she'd wake up suddenly drenched in sweat. Paul watched as Sarah moved around the house like a ghost. Their 5- and 7-year-olds were trying to show her the arts and crafts project they'd made at school that day, but Paul could tell Sarah was struggling just to stay focused on them. And so Paul decided he would call a friend who was a doctor. At this point, they just needed more opinions about what was going on here. However, Paul didn't want to alarm Sarah, so he excused himself. He found a quiet spot out in the yard and placed the call. He described Sarah's symptoms to his friend. After a moment, the friend said it sounded like what she was dealing with could be a hormonal issue. He wondered if maybe Sarah had something going on with her thyroid, a gland found in the neck. He explained that thyroid disorders can cause weight loss, sweating, and muscle soreness. And so Paul's friend suggested that Sarah make an appointment with an endocrinologist, a doctor who specializes in hormone disorders. A week later, Paul and Sarah sat together on a park bench, watching their kids climb all over some playground equipment. Sarah had come to meet Paul and the kids after her appointment with the endocrinologist. Paul tried to read his wife's expression, but she just sat there in silence. Finally, after a couple of minutes, she sighed and told him what the endocrinologist had said. The results of her blood tests were normal, and the doctor couldn't find anything wrong with her hormone levels. And so the endocrinologist had told Sarah to try to reduce the stress in her life and maybe take a vacation. And then to Paul's surprise, Sarah just burst out laughing. And then he started laughing along with her. The doctor thought a vacation would help Sarah feel better. It was so absurd, it was funny. But after their laughter died down, a serious expression came over Sarah's face. She told Paul she just didn't understand. She had listened to the doctors and taken her iron supplements and antidepressants, but nothing helped. She was as tired as ever, and her symptoms, that were both physical and mental, were only getting more intense. And it pained Sarah to admit that as a result of that, she was no longer available for her kids. Physically, she was still with them, but mentally, she felt totally checked out. So, after talking it over with Paul, she decided it was time to try a different route. At this point, she was willing to try anything to feel better. A week later, Sarah sat on a comfortable couch inside of a dimly lit room. She could feel a wave of nausea coming over her as the smell of scented candles filled the air. She tried her best to ignore her queasy stomach and focus on her breathing as an alternative medicine practitioner asked her question after question about her lifestyle. And after talking with her for about 30 minutes, the practitioner told Sarah that what she was experiencing was something called adrenal fatigue. Though it's not an officially recognized medical diagnosis, it includes symptoms like tiredness, anxiety, and trouble sleeping, which were all issues Sarah was facing. And so the alternative medicine practitioner recommended that Sarah use some special serums, clean up her diet, and of course, try to reduce stress. This didn't sound very scientific to Sarah, but again, at this point, she was willing to try anything. So she agreed to give the new lifestyle regimen a try. Several weeks later, in early July of 2014, Sarah stood in front of the stove boiling some pasta. She leaned against the counter to support herself. She had followed the alternative medical practitioner's advice as best as she could, but that hadn't helped either. She'd lost even more weight and felt weaker than ever. Her head ached and she had this cold that she couldn't shake. But Sarah was not about to let her illness, or whatever it was, stop her from living her life. So she was powering through her daily chores, even though she would have much preferred to lie down. Sarah turned the burner down to a simmer, and as she did, she was suddenly seized by this deep cough. She instinctively covered her mouth with a towel, and when she pulled it away, she saw she had coughed up quite a bit of blood. This was new and frightening. Sarah's overwhelming sense of dread immediately returned. Something was wrong with her, and there was no way it was just stress. It was time to go back to her medical doctor and tell him to take her symptoms more seriously. A few days later, Sarah and Paul sat inside of an exam room, reviewing an x-ray of Sarah's chest with their doctor. The doctor pointed to a hazy white patch in the lower area of Sarah's right lung. The doctor said the x-ray showed Sarah had pneumonia, a lung infection that can cause chest pain, cough, and fatigue. He explained that most cases of pneumonia resolve in a matter of weeks, but left untreated, the infection can go on and on. He told Sarah that because most cases of pneumonia are caused by bacteria, he was prescribing her some antibiotics that should knock out the infection. Sarah looked over at her husband, and he looked relieved. And all things considered, Sarah felt relieved too. She'd known plenty of people who had gotten pneumonia and recovered just fine after taking antibiotics. So Sarah got up and thanked her doctor. But as she followed Paul to the car, she couldn't help but wonder. It had been months since she first felt sick. If this was as simple as pneumonia, then why had it taken so long for someone to finally figure it out? A month later, Paul sat with Sarah and the kids in the den playing a board game. Paul was getting more and more worried about his wife. Sarah said she felt a little better after finishing her antibiotics, but she still wasn't her old self, not even close. She was only able to work a few days a week, and she rarely left the house unless it was to go to their office. Just then, Sarah started coughing, and she excused herself to go to the bathroom. A moment later, Paul heard a gagging sound. He rushed to the bathroom, where he found his wife bent over the toilet, and there was red liquid in the bowl. She had coughed up blood again. Paul sprang into action. He called their neighbors and asked if they could watch the kids for a few hours. He needed to get his wife to the emergency room right away. A few days later, a pulmonologist named Dr. Corbin Moss reviewed the results of a chest CT scan with his new patient, a young mother named Sarah Weber. A pulmonologist is a physician who specializes in the respiratory system. Sarah had been suffering from a cough, fatigue, and weight loss for several months. A chest x-ray had revealed a lesion on her right lung, which her family physician had diagnosed as pneumonia. She had coughed up blood at least twice, and the second time, her husband Paul had rushed her to the emergency room and she'd been referred to Dr. Moss. Today, Sarah sat quietly inside of his office, looking lethargic and very thin. Meanwhile, her husband Paul paced anxiously around the room. Dr. Moss told Sarah and Paul that he had seen many cases of recurrent pneumonia, and while it was certainly possible that that's what Sarah was dealing with, he still wanted to conduct a bronchoscopy to learn more about the suspicious area on her right lung. During this procedure, the doctor would insert a scope down her throat to inspect her airway and lungs, and also collect tiny samples of her tissue to be analyzed in a laboratory. The procedure sounded unpleasant, but Sarah immediately agreed to do it. Dr. Moss nodded and said he'd get it scheduled as soon as possible. Following the bronchoscopy, Sarah and Paul met again with Dr. Moss to review the results. Dr. Moss took a deep breath and pulled the results up on his computer. He told Sarah and Paul that he wished he was misreading the data, but there was no denying it. Sarah's results were definitive. She had lung cancer. Sarah just stared at him. She couldn't believe what she just heard. She was only 39 and had never smoked a cigarette in her whole life. How could she possibly have lung cancer? Sarah barely noticed when Paul put his arms around her, and then somewhere in the distance she could barely hear Dr. Moss's voice. But Sarah made herself tune back in just in time to hear the doctor say the words non-small cell adenocarcinoma, the most common type of lung cancer. But the doctor then also said that at least they had caught this early. But Sarah thought back to her months and months of symptoms, and she wondered how early this really was. The next morning, Sarah rummaged around her closet, trying to decide on an outfit for their son's preschool orientation. It was hard for her to concentrate. As usual, she hadn't slept at all. Her diagnosis was constantly looming over her. It didn't feel real. Nothing did. And yet, here she was, standing in the closet getting dressed. Because even when you got the worst news, life still went on. They were running very late to the orientation. Sarah could hear Paul down the hall trying to get their son ready. She needed to hurry, but her body could only move so fast. Finally, Sarah just grabbed a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. But as she pulled on her jeans, her sight suddenly went blurry. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, hoping that when she opened them, her vision would return to normal. But when she opened her eyes, she was still seeing double. A moment later, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She didn't even notice her husband walk into the closet until she saw him kneeling right beside her. Somehow, she'd ended up curled up on the floor. Sarah told him she couldn't breathe and she could barely see. Plus, she thought she might be having a panic attack. She looked at Paul and she could barely make out his features, but she could hear him shouting for an ambulance into his phone. Three days later, Sarah lay in a hospital bed trying to read a magazine. It was hard to believe that just 3 days ago she had collapsed like that. She was lucky Paul had been there and called an ambulance. Because it turned out she was not just having a panic attack, she was having a stroke. If she had not gotten emergency help when she did, she could have died. Sarah looked over at the chair beside her hospital bed. Paul had been sitting and sleeping there for the last 72 hours while their kids stayed with relatives. Now, Paul was down the hall, meeting with their doctors about her prognosis and treatment plan. Sarah had insisted that they discuss everything without her. She just didn't want to be there. She didn't want to know how long she had left to live or how advanced the cancer was. She knew it was bad. She didn't need to hear anything else, just the treatment plan. They agreed that Paul would tell her once they were alone. Sarah carefully reached over to her bedside table where she had a framed photo of their kids that Paul had brought from home. The kids knew she was sick, but she and Paul had not told them all the details. Sarah wanted to tell them everything, but they were too young for that kind of heartache. While Sarah waited inside her room, Paul spoke to the doctor in his office. The physician said that although Sarah had only just been diagnosed with lung cancer, the cancer had been growing in her body for quite a while. In fact, Sarah's cancer was already at stage 4, which is the most advanced stage. It meant that the disease had spread from her right lung to other parts of her body, specifically her left lung, liver, spine, and hip bones. It also had invaded her brain, which had caused the stroke. The doctor told Paul he wanted to run a few more tests, but Sarah needed to start chemotherapy right away. Her condition was dire, and without treatment, she would only have a very short amount of time to live. Paul felt like the earth was falling out from under him. He fought back tears, but after a few moments, he steadied himself, knowing he would have to face his wife with strength as he shared this news. She would have to start treatment right away. 3 weeks later, Paul climbed the stairs of his house with a glass of water for Sarah. She was back home after undergoing her 3rd chemo treatment. Paul knew the treatment had left his wife with very little hair, and she was now more frail than ever, so he was trying to do everything he could to help her through it. However, when Paul entered the bedroom, he nearly dropped the glass. Sarah was lying on the floor, barely moving. Paul rushed over to her, asking if she needed to go to the hospital. But Sarah just shook her head and said she couldn't take it anymore. Her body was giving up. Paul sat beside her, holding her close. He ran his fingers through the thin remnants of her hair and kissed the top of her head. He could understand why Sarah was ready to give up after all the suffering of the past year, but he simply couldn't let her. He and the kids needed her too much. Paul urged his wife to think of her treatment like a long race. She just needed to keep putting one foot in front of the other. He saw that Sarah's eyes were wet with tears, but she still managed to smile and promised she would keep on fighting. Seeing just a little light in his wife's eyes gave Paul hope, but he knew that she needed more than the care she had gotten up to now. So Paul gave his wife another kiss and helped her to her feet, then he told her he'd be right back. There were calls he wanted to make. That afternoon, Paul tracked down a team of thoracic oncologists, doctors who specialize in the treatment of cancers in the chest area. Paul's doctor friend had told him they were the best of the best, working on cases exactly like Sarah's. 90% of lung cancer victims are current or former smokers, but these doctors focused on the remaining 10% who had never smoked a single cigarette. After Paul presented the facts, the team agreed to take Sarah's case. Several weeks later, Sarah and Paul met with the team of thoracic oncologists. With what they'd discovered, they were actually very hopeful that Sarah's condition could be managed. It would turn out they could pinpoint exactly what had caused her lung cancer. It wasn't smoking, or some kind of toxic exposure, or any external agent. It was caused by something inside her body. Specifically, the doctor said that Sarah had a flaw in her genes known as the ROS1 mutation. ROS1 is a gene that can drive cancer growth by sending abnormal signals to cells, telling them to divide uncontrollably and form tumors. The doctor said this mutation was quite rare. It typically presented in just 1 to 2% of patients with lung cancer. Usually, these were younger people who were light smokers or, like Sarah, had never smoked at all. Now, at first, this was very disheartening for Sarah, but the doctors told her, in a way, she was actually lucky to have this mutation, because ROS1 positive cancers are much more treatable than other forms of lung cancer. Sarah began targeted therapy right away. Her doctors prescribed drugs to specifically block the signals coming from the ROS1 mutation, aiming to slow or stop the cancer's progression. And now, according to her website, Sarah has been cancer-free for at least 3 years. She's returned to running her business with Paul and has also started her own meditation practice. She also offers courses for cancer patients and survivors, teaching them how to find peace and strength throughout the unique challenge of cancer. And that even when things get dark, they are never alone.
Before sunrise on August 22, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He didn't know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I gotta remember it. But as he lay there kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it's going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up it'll still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick. And that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just can't get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed, he swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground, he stands up and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they're okay.
But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nios, and Nios is extremely rural. There's no electricity, there's no running water, and there's no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into two parts. There's Upper Nios and Lower Nios. Ephraim lived in Upper Nios, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nios, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nios, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nios, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nios, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around. So, without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nios to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nios. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nios, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking and insects would be humming and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who's sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he's supposed to go over and help this woman or console her. But suddenly this wave of fear came over him. The combination of having no idea what's going on, his mind really wasn't working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just couldn't handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nios. The villagers in Lower Nios lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nios was a very happy and lively place with kids running around and animals walking in the road and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nios, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nios, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, All he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nios, and he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open, and he stepped inside, and as soon as he did, he just stopped. Because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he's staring at this dead woman, and then he looks up and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first Ephraim thought, oh, they're sleeping. But then as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars. And many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed, with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road, he's stepping over bodies, he has no idea what to make of this, and then way down the road, up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him. But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide, and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare, and they didn't stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. They just kept on running down the road, past all the bodies. Ephraim didn't try to stop them. He just watched as they passed, and then at some point they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place, because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nios villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nios from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nios, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nios. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nios must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nios, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds or sitting in chairs or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph Naquain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim.
The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now Joseph has opened the door, and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out, and so he too just stood there looking at Joseph, and the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently, and then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just couldn't process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there, there were people and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village, but Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just didn't make sense. He was kind of incoherent. And then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously, and so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nios to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nios, and when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nios that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nios had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock, and then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nios." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nios 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim, along with Ephraim's family. They also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nios, in an area called Lake Manoon, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people. And after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened. And they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again. And in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal. But nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up. It sounded preposterous. But now, in Nios, it looked very much like their unknown, unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nios, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown, unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nios is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nios. A lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that won't hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous. Your skin will start to feel like it's on fire. You'll have rapid breathing. It'll be horrible, but you'll most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nios had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud booming sound that night. Now, we don't know exactly what that sound was, but it's safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes. And when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we can't see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud, and then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nios and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nios and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoon. It was the unknown, unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nios disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nios, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unknown unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again.
In September 2006, 26-year-old Jodi Arias met 29-year-old Travis Alexander at a big business convention in Las Vegas. The two hit it off immediately, with Travis on the same day he met her inviting Jodi to be his guest at his company's formal dinner that night.
After the dinner was over, Travis and Jody stayed up all night chatting with each other, and the next day, Travis was telling his friends at this convention that he had, quote, found his wife. After the convention was over, Travis and Jody would continue to see each other, even though it was a long-distance relationship. Travis lived in Arizona and Jody lived in California. But they would meet up and they would travel and take beautiful pictures and post to social media. It just seemed like they were a dream couple that were so happy together. While the couple's social media posts might have made it seem like they were this perfect couple, Travis's friends began to notice some very strange behavior by Jody early on in their relationship. Jody just seemed totally obsessed with Travis. She could not keep her hands off of him. Travis would be talking to his friends and Jody would come up beside him and literally grab onto him and cling to him. And Travis would try to push her off of him, and she would just come right back and grab onto him. But it wasn't playful and jokey and funny. It was like she literally needed to be holding on to Travis. Jody would get really upset anytime Travis was interacting with a female. Didn't matter their age or their relationship to Travis. It was like she just could not hack any other females in his life. She would follow Travis anytime he went to the bathroom, and she would put her ear to the door and try to eavesdrop in case there was somebody else in the bathroom that Travis could have been talking to. She began showing up to Travis's house totally unannounced at all hours. And one time when the house was locked and Travis wasn't even home, she snuck into the house through the doggy door. Initially, Travis's friends just thought it was weird behavior, but over time, they started to feel like Jody might actually be dangerous. And so they sat him down one day and they kind of had like an intervention. And they said, hey, Travis, there is something off about Jody. Her behavior is just totally weird, and it seems like she is just never gonna let you go. I think you need to break this off and just find a way to cut ties with this woman. As they're speaking to him, they hear something outside of the room they're in, which had all the doors closed. And Travis stands up, walks over, opens the door, and standing right there is Jody. She was eavesdropping, and she was furious. And she looked in at all of them and gave them absolute death stares and stormed off. Shortly after this intervention, Travis takes his friend's advice and he does break it off with Jody, and he kind of moves on with his life. Now remember, he lives in Arizona and Jody lives in California, so you'd think it would be pretty easy to break up because you're never going to run into each other. And that's what Travis was kind of banking on, that he could get a fresh start and never see her again. But about 2 weeks after they broke up, Jody moved to Arizona. Around the same time, Travis starts dating a new woman named Lisa, and almost immediately, Jody starts stalking Lisa, showing up at her house, tapping on her windows and running away. She started slashing Travis's tires. I mean, she was a total menace. She was trying to break them up. But a few months after she arrived in Arizona, Jody ultimately packs up and heads back to California in April of 2008. And Travis, Lisa, his girlfriend, and all of Travis's friends are so relieved. They felt like now the breakup is final. 2 months after Jody leaves Arizona and goes back to California, Travis misses a really big business meeting. And at first, his friends are calling him and kind of giving him a hard time about missing this meeting, but he wasn't responding. And after a couple of days, his friends decided they needed to go do a welfare check and make sure he really was okay. They go to his house, they open it up, and immediately when they walk in, they see blood on the carpet, and they're calling out for Travis. Travis is nowhere to be found. They walk through the house and they discover in the bathroom Travis's body. He was dead and laying in the tub. They call the police, who come over and immediately suspect Jody Arias, who denies that she was ever there, that she had left, she was in Arizona, that she had nothing to do with this. But during the investigation, they find a camera inside of the washing machine inside of Travis's house. They were able to dry it off and extract the last few pictures that were taken on the camera. The first few pictures are of Jody herself. She's clearly inside of Travis's house. And then at some point she goes into the bathroom where Travis was. He's taking a shower. She takes this picture, and then immediately following this picture, she proceeds to stab Travis to death. In May of 2013, Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in jail without parole. By September of 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia was starting to show signs of significant activity. The tremors had become so powerful that the citizens of a nearby town called Amero, that was home to 31,000 people, they started to become very concerned. If this thing were to go off, we're only 30 miles away, we'd be leveled. And unfortunately, just a couple of months later, on November 13th, 1985, the volcano would erupt, and it would create a massive mudslide that would just devastate Amero. The mud flow covered 85% of this town in heavy, thick sludge. It destroyed buildings and bridges, and it killed 25,000 people. Remember, there's only 31,000 people in this village to begin with, so 80% of the population has been killed by this mudslide. Because of how big of a disaster this was, it took a while for the rescue efforts to mobilize, and so anybody that was on the fringe of being saved unfortunately perished because no one was there to rescue them in time. And then when rescue crews did get out and did start helping people, there just wasn't enough. There weren't enough people to help. And so hundreds of people that could have been saved were just trapped and no one could get to them in time. Photojournalist Frank Fournier arrived in Colombia 2 days after this eruption with the intent to photograph the ground rescue that was going on inside of Amero. When he actually arrived in Amero, he was really shocked to see just how completely destroyed this town was and how totally ineffective the rescue efforts were. It was just totally chaotic. It wasn't really clear who was helping who. There were people literally dying all over the place. It just seemed crazy that this was not being handled better. Amid this chaos, a farmer approached Frank and told him he needed to come over and try to help this girl who was trapped under a house. So he brings Frank over to this house that's been completely submerged in water and mud, and clinging to a branch is this 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez that's been trapped up to her neck in water. She's pinned by something in the water. They didn't know what it was, but she's been there for 60 hours. When Frank arrived, he spoke to the other rescuers that were there trying to get her out, and they said that she's been in great spirits and she's been joking about how she doesn't want to be late for school. She's just been a really positive force, and we really want to get her out, but it keeps raining, so the water keeps rising and she's already up to her neck and she's just trapped. We can't get her out. Shortly after Frank arrives, Omaira went from chipper and lively and kind of making light of everything to most likely realizing that she wasn't going to get out of the water. And so she began telling the rescue workers to let her be, to let her rest. And she propped herself over this branch and she just laid there, kind of allowing herself to pass away. Frank felt totally helpless. I mean, he's looking at this poor girl that's going to die unless they can get her out of the water, but no one seems to be able to do it. And it just seemed totally impossible that we can't just find a way to get her out. But it would turn out that her foot was pinned under a brick door, and her aunt, who had passed away and was trapped under the rubble, had grabbed her ankle and had died that way. So it was like a death grip on her ankle. And so, not knowing what to do, Frank just did what he knew how to do, which was take pictures. And he knelt down and he took this picture of Omaira. And very shortly after this picture was taken, she would pass away. This picture would win the 1986 World Press Photo of the Year. When it was published, it was so disturbing that this poor girl was not able to be rescued that it created an international backlash on Colombia's nearly non-existent rescue efforts. Ed Gein was always a little bit off. His classmates and his teachers recalled him being very shy, but at the same time having these strange mannerisms where all of a sudden he would burst out hysterically laughing, usually at something he had been muttering to himself in class. The school blamed Ed's mother for Ed's kind of odd behavior, because Ed would admit that his mother punished him if he showed signs of having friends. So Ed's childhood was incredibly lonely and isolated. Ed's mother would confine he, along with his brother Henry, to their farm. He was basically never allowed to leave with the exception of school, and when he was at the farm, his mother would regularly read from the Bible and would tell Ed and his brother Henry that basically everybody else in the world is evil. We are the only pure ones. Everyone is evil and you should stay away from them. In 1944, when Ed was 38 years old, he and his brother Henry were burning away some marsh vegetation on their property. And at some point, the fire got out of control and the fire department had to be called in. And after they put out the fire, Ed was okay, but they couldn't find Henry. He was just gone. That night, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh in that same area where the burn was going on. He had died of asphyxiation. At first, the fire was blamed, but then authorities discovered that Henry had actually died before the fire started. And so all eyes turned to Ed, who was the only one with him at the time, but there was no hard evidence connecting Ed to Henry, and Ed said, "I didn't do it." So Henry's death remained labeled an accident, even though basically everyone believed that Ed must have been the guy that strangled his brother to death before the fire was set. Shortly after his brother's death, Ed's mother also died, leaving Ed alone in this farmhouse. Ed began to make some modifications to the farmhouse, not to improve it or to make it bigger and better, but rather to board off all of the rooms in the house that his mother ever used. He basically made them time capsules. He didn't touch them, he just sealed them off. And so he confined himself to a single room in this farmhouse that he did not take care of. And so filth is just piling up everywhere. And so he just kind of lived in squalor in this one weird room. While living in seclusion, Ed became obsessed with cannibalism. He basically spent all his time reading about cannibalism inside of this tiny room in his boarded up farmhouse. And that's how he lived his life for the next 10 years. No one really ever saw him. Then in November of 1957, a local hardware store owner, her name was Bernice Worden, goes missing. When police show up at the store to have a look around, they find bloodstains all over the place, and they discover in the register that the last person to make a purchase inside of the store was Ed Gein. So they go to Ed Gein's house to interview him and see if he knows anything about Bernice Worden, and so they're bracing themselves for probably finding her body at Ed's house. But they were not prepared for what they actually found at his house. What they find would end up inspiring movies like Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Basically, inside of Ed's house was a whole bunch of human remains, but not in the way that you would imagine. Ed was taking human body parts and making things like kitchen utensils and bowls, and he was using skin to create seats and lampshades and bedposts. I mean, his whole house was like built of human bones and flesh. Bernice Worden's body was found as well, and she was kind of hung up as if she was next up to be made into some sort of kitchen utensil or chair or table. When questioned, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Worden, but as for the dozens of other bodies that were inside of the house, he claims they were from robbing graves, but no one really knew if that was true or not, and they weren't able to ever actually convict him for anything beyond the killing of Bernice Worden. As for his motive, he told investigators that what he really wanted to do, what he intended to do, was build what he called a woman suit that would resemble his mother, and it would allow him to, quote, crawl into his mother's skin. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to a mental hospital where he stayed until his death in 1984. Here is just a sampling of some of the things that Ed Gein made using human body parts. What is not pictured here are things like his lampshade, his seat, as well as his gloves and his belt. If you feel so inclined, you can Google those things. On August 22nd, 1922, shots rang out from inside a stately Victorian home in Beverly Hills where Dolly and Fred Ostrich lived. Neighbors called police right away, and when officers stepped into the front door, they saw the entire house was trashed. On the floor in the living room was Fred, who had been shot to death, and next to him were 3 .25 caliber shell casings. With weapons drawn, the police cleared the entire first floor. There was no one down there. They heard screaming coming from upstairs, and so they run up the stairs, and they get up there, and no one's upstairs. And then they heard the screaming again, and they realized it was coming from inside of a closet in the master bedroom. And so as the police are clearing the second floor, they yell out to this woman and they say, "Who are you? What are you doing in the closet?" And she yells back, "I'm Dolly. I'm okay, but I'm trapped." And so after the police finish clearing the upstairs and they're sure it's safe, they go over to the closet door and they do try the handle. It's locked. They ask her, "Do you know where the key is?" And she says no. And so before they start trying to break the door down, they did a quick search of the upstairs to see if maybe they could find the key to the closet. And sure enough, across the hall in another bedroom, they found it on the ground. And so they took the key back, they opened the door up, and out came Dolly. She was okay, but obviously very frantic and panicked. And they asked her, what happened? And she told them a very abrupt and chaotic story. She said she had been hanging clothes inside of this big walk-in closet, and her back was to the door when she heard a fight break out on the first floor. And before she could even turn around to go investigate, she said the closet door was swinging shut, and then she heard it lock from the outside, and she didn't get to see who it was that shut the door. The whole thing was a bit of a head scratcher for police, because they're thinking, okay, well, was it one person that attacked Fred downstairs and then ran upstairs and shut and
then locked the door immediately afterwards before Dolly could come out and see? Or was there two people, one person downstairs attacking and one person upstairs shutting and locking the door? Or was it more than two people? And despite the house being totally ransacked and there being lots of valuable stuff in their house, Dolly said the only thing she could tell was missing was the diamond-encrusted wristwatch that Fred always wore. It was not on his wrist when they discovered his body. And why, detectives wondered, were these burglars or this burglar carrying a .25 caliber weapon? Something that small was more likely to be found in a woman's purse than in a home invasion. When police spoke to neighbors, they were quick to say Fred and Dolly fought all the time, and earlier that night they had gotten into a really bad one. But as much as police wanted to point the finger at Dolly, it was just impossible for her to have committed this crime, because how could she have murdered Fred and then ran upstairs and locked herself in the closet from the outside and then also somehow deposited that key across the hall in another room? It just didn't make any sense. But since the police had little else to go on, they dug into the new widow's past. Dolly was born in Germany in 1880, and following a move to Milwaukee, Wisconsin just before the turn of the century, she married Fred, who was 3 years older than her. Fred was driven and successful, but he was also a raging alcoholic and prone to violence. And so as Fred built up his textile empire, opening up factory after factory all across the Midwest, their marriage grew strained. He was mean and she was lonely. When they moved from Milwaukee to Southern California in 1918, their new neighbors immediately were aware of the fact that Dolly and Fred fought loudly and often, and they frequently bickered in public. Police looked high and low to see if Dolly had maybe taken a lover, but no one had ever seen her with anyone but Fred. And so while they might be miserable, they seemed to be faithful. And so try as they might, the police could find no clues that suggested anything darker or more dangerous than a petty and meaningless marriage. The case hung open, and suspicion continued to trail Dolly, even though it was physically impossible for her to have committed the crime. Now free from her unhappy marriage, Dolly moved into a new home in Los Angeles, and she took up with her estate lawyer, Herman Shapiro, who was handling her husband's $1 million estate. But just like her late husband, her new boyfriend, Shapiro, worked long hours, and he was not around much, so she was lonely all over again. So she went out and got another boyfriend, a guy by the name of Roy Klum, and she began seeing the men at the same time. A year after Fred's death, Captain Herman Klein of the Beverly Hills Police Department dropped by Dolly's estate lawyer/boyfriend's office. Detectives were still suspicious of Dolly, even though the case still made no sense. And so Captain Klein goes into Shapiro's office, and wouldn't you know it, sitting on the desk is this beautiful diamond-encrusted wristwatch that looks an awful lot like the watch Dolly claimed was the one thing stolen from her house on the night of her husband's murder. When the captain asked Shapiro how he got this watch, Shapiro told him that Dolly had given it to him as a gift, but I know where you're going with this because I thought the same thing too. I know about the missing diamond watch on the night of the murder. I asked Dolly about it when she gave it to me, and she told me that that was actually a mistake. The watch was never missing, and she later on found it tucked underneath a sofa cushion in the living room. The captain was not buying this, and so as soon as he left Shapiro's office, he immediately confronted Dolly about the watch, and Dolly said, you know what, that's right, I did find the watch, but I didn't think it was that important, so I didn't tell you guys. The captain couldn't believe what he was hearing. And shortly after, the newspapers found out about this new twist in this totally bizarre case, and they went wild with it, putting all the heat back on Dolly. Spooked by the headlines, Dolly's second boyfriend, Roy Klum, came forward to the police and said, I have a confession to make. Dolly made me hide one of her .25 caliber pistols, and I threw it in the La Brea tar pits. And then before police could even go get that gun, one of Dolly's neighbors came forward and said, yeah, I got a confession to make. Dolly asked me to get rid of a .25 caliber pistol, and I buried it in my backyard. So police went out and recovered both weapons, but they were so badly rusted, they couldn't confirm if they were in fact the murder weapons. And Dolly had an excuse. When the police confronted her with these guns, she said, oh yeah, those old things, I've had those in the house for years, but you know, given the circumstances of my husband's death, just felt a little awkward keeping them around the house, so I had some friends get rid of them. The police were not buying this, and so in July of 1923, they arrested Dolly for killing Fred. But despite these new developments, the facts of the case had not changed. It was still physically impossible for Dolly to have committed this crime. She was locked in the closet from the outside. And so with Dolly in jail awaiting trial, investigators tirelessly hacked into her story to try to find holes in it, but they had no success. And so after every theory that might connect her to the crime was ultimately discarded, they had to drop the murder charges and Dolly was released. 7 years went by and the crime was largely forgotten about. And then in 1930, Dolly and her estate lawyer boyfriend Shapiro, they broke up.
And Shapiro immediately called the police and said, "You know what? I haven't been entirely truthful. I know a lot more about what happened to Fred than I've let on, and in fact, I have someone in the office with me right now that can tell you the whole story." Investigators flew to Shapiro's office, they go through the doors, and sitting inside is a man they never knew existed. His name was Otto Sandhuber. He was a quiet, small sewing machine repairman / aspiring dime store fiction writer. And the story he would tell them would be more bizarre and lurid than any investigator could have imagined. It began almost a decade before the murder. When Otto was a teenager, he had worked for Fred in one of his Milwaukee factories. One day in 1913, Dolly complained to Fred that her sewing machine was broken. And so Fred asked one of his employees, who he knew was a sewing machine repairman, the then 17-year-old Otto, if he would go over to his house and fix the sewing machine for his wife. Dolly knew her husband was going to send Otto specifically to their house, and she was very attracted to Otto. And so when Otto showed up, all she had on was a silk robe, stockings, and heavy perfume. Thus began Dolly and Otto's affair, which at first they conducted in a pretty typical way, meeting secretly in hotels, but when that became burdensome, they moved their relationship back into the ostrich home, with Otto needing to sneak in and out around Fred's schedule. But it wasn't long before nosy neighbors were asking Dolly, "Who's that strange man coming around your house all the time?" And she would say, "Oh, that's my vagabond half-brother." But Dolly and Otto knew they couldn't continue in this way. But instead of breaking it off or returning to secret hotel liaisons, Dolly decided that Otto should take up residence in the ostrich home in a secret hideaway in the attic. That way no one would see him coming or going. Otto, who had no family to miss him, quit his job at the factory, moved into the secret room, and then never left. Pretty quickly, Otto and Dolly fell into a routine where when Fred would leave for work for the day, Otto would come downstairs, they'd spend time together, and then Otto would clean the house and then make bathtub gin. Before Fred came home, Otto would sneak back upstairs to write pulp stories about lust and adventure, and he would read newspapers and magazines by candlelight. Around this time, Fred started complaining to Dolly about strange noises in the house. He also started to notice they were running through food a lot faster than normal, and a couple times he thought he was short a cigar. But no matter how much Fred complained, Dolly was always able to convince him that everything he was hearing and seeing was in his head. And so over the next 5 years, they would live in 4 homes in Milwaukee, and always these strange sounds and oddities about the house would follow them, but Fred never investigated. In 1918, Fred told Dolly he wanted to move to Southern California, and so Dolly hunted down a house with an attic, a rarity in the area, and she sent Otto ahead. When Fred and Dolly arrived, Otto was already ensconced in the attic, and Fred moved in right beneath him. By the time Fred and Dolly got in their final argument on the night of August 22nd, 1922, Otto had been secretly living with them for almost a decade. On that deadly night, Otto was in his secret room listening to drunk Fred getting louder and angrier and clearly getting physical with Dolly. And so worried that he might kill his lover, Otto leapt out of the attic and ran downstairs carrying 2 .25 caliber pistols. He runs into the living room and he confronts Fred. And Fred is astounded to see his formerly teenage sewing machine repairman, who abruptly quit the factory so suddenly and completely, now standing in his living room. And so Fred lunged at Otto, and Otto just started shooting. It was then that Dolly hatched the scheme that had almost let them get away with it. Knowing the police would be there any minute, Dolly staged the house to look like a robbery. She told Otto to lock her inside of the closet and then ordered him to go back up into the attic. And so when the police got there, Otto was crouched silently right above their heads. After the killing, Otto moved in with Dolly in her new house, and even though they could have had a normal open relationship, Dolly ordered Otto to go live in the attic of this new house as well. It wasn't until a year later, when Dolly was briefly arrested after the police found out about the hidden guns, that Otto was forced to come out of the attic. While Dolly was sitting in jail for these gun charges, she begged her estate lawyer boyfriend, Shapiro, to go get groceries for her vagabond half-brother, Otto, who lived in her attic. She said, when you delivered them, make sure you go to the bedroom and knock on the ceiling. That will let him know it's safe to come out. But when Shapiro arrived and followed the procedure and Otto came out, Otto was so starved for human interaction and conversation that he wound up telling Shapiro the whole insane story. But instead of going to police, Shapiro told Otto that he should just leave. And he did. He went and became a janitor, and he got married. The secret held until Dolly and Shapiro broke up for good, at which point Shapiro called the police. Dolly and Otto were arrested, and the press went insane. They called this the Batman case because Otto was living like a bat in a cave. This was before Batman the comic was a thing. Otto was convicted of manslaughter, but the statute of limitations was up, so he was allowed to walk free. As for Dolly, she was allowed to walk free too, because the jury hung on her conspiracy to commit murder charges. After the trial, Otto disappeared and nothing more is known about him. As for Dolly, she stayed in LA and she died in 1961 at the age of 80, 2 weeks after marrying yet again. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret
too fast. A flash of blue and gold, the stories we are told, but look beyond the street. The rhythm starts to meet 1,000,000 miles away. Defining yesterday, are we just dust in motion, caught in the ocean? No hands upon the dial, we've got more than a while.
Kinda weird when you watch me take a nap. No, I don't need you to stuff my stocking. Coming down the chimney, have you heard of knocking? No, I don't wanna hear you ho, ho, ho. Just leave me alone, let me play in the snow. No, I don't want my name on your list, and mistletoe won't make me give you a kiss. Santa, what the hell is wrong with you? It really ain't normal, the things that you do. I didn't ask for presents under the tree. I didn't want your presents, but you're still here with me. Santa, what the hell is wrong with you? No, I don't.
In today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's Cocoa Puffs with similarly shaped dog food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username